I think we may need this. We've got about 50 people assembled, looks like. A few more people are coming in. But I want to welcome you to this, used to be annual Halloween night tour, but this is the first time in 2 years we've been able to do it. 2 years ago, some of you may remember the big storm Halloween night and had to cancel it. And then last year, of course, was COVID. So, and we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do it this year because right now I'm supposed to be in Palestine with Jane picking olives. But we couldn't get in because of COVID restrictions. So this is the consolation prize. And looking forward to sharing the cemetery with you. How many of you have been on other tours of the graveyard? Okay. So there'll be a few new twists and turns, but some of them will be familiar to you. And we won't hit every grave out there. There are quite a few since 1757. And we do have a book, though, that has about 46 of the stories in it. So if any of you are interested in that, it's $10 that goes to the Cemetery Association. There's the requisite broad brim hat here if you want to throw $10 in. And they'll share a lot of the stories that we won't get to and a number of the ones that we will, but you may want more detail. You may not remember everything I say. And half of what I say may be made up anyway. You can check with that. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Max Carter, and a member of Newgarden Friends with my wife Jane. Moved down here 31 years ago, and I retired 6 years ago from teaching across the street at that little Quaker institution. Quakers gathered here as early as 1751 and had come down the Philadelphia Wagon Road and settled in here. Hot on their heels around 1772 came a whole bunch from Nantucket, and we'll meet some of those various groups out there. The Nantucket folk are your familiar names, the department store Macy's, the coffee Folgers and Starbucks, and a lot of the Underground Railroad folk with Coffins. And then the Pennsylvania names are the Mendenhalls and the Beesons and the Hadleys and the Henshaws and all of that. And we'll meet a bunch of them out there. What I hope to do is kind of head out through the hedge. You know why they put a hedge and a fence around graveyards, don't you? People are just dying to get in. We'll head through the hedge, and among the first people we're going to meet are their ancestors, the Ballingers. We have actual Ballingers with us who can remind us of the French connections. We have German connections, and it'll be quite an international group, and they can tell us all about the boulangerie ancestors, all those bakers that came over as Huguenots from France and became Ballingers here. And then we'll pretty much go clockwise around the cemetery and hope to hold it to about an hour 15, an hour and a half. I can go on, so feel free to peel off if you feel necessary. Sadly enough, because we weren't sure if we'd be able to do this year, we don't have the interpreters. We usually have 15 or so people who are dressed up as some of the moldering old Quakers out there and share some of the stories. And we don't have, at the very end, the requisite Starbucks coffee that we get free from over there because the last grave we visit is a Starbucks. And the meeting house isn't open for the necessary, but there are woods around and trees. So anyway, if nature calls. And feel free, please, to ask questions, or if you have insight, information about some of the folk we'll be visiting, please add in. I know that the Ballingers shared a bit the last time they were through, and I always pick up some more information to help add into actual facts to what I usually share. So anyway.
Are you going to go by and do the Hall of Famer over here?
Oh yeah,
okay,
we're going to do baseball.
All right, good.
And a little bit of football.
Okay.
But we're not going to get down to basketball this time. Okay. All righty.
I thought it was on the right-hand side of the road, not the left-hand side of the road. Well, yeah, but then I went beyond it and said, "You're here." And it's like, okay, where am I? I was thinking it might be on this side afterwards.
Yeah. Okay, if you want to come on in through the hedges, don't worry about stepping on graves. Quakers treat their graveyards like parks. So, and so far, there's only been one person on all these years of tours say that there's anything untoward that has happened to them on this tour. The new president of the college 8 years ago was on the Halloween tour, and afterwards spoke to me very quietly saying, "Something grabbed me by the ankles as I was walking through." But that's the only occasion we've had. So Quakers are as benign in death as they are in life, so you don't have to worry about Quaker hauntings. So here we are in quite the Ballinger section. There are a lot of Ballingers scattered around here. Max and Lauren, how many Ballingers are buried here, did they say? 60 some?
I know it was 50 something at least.
Yeah. Because Henry Ballinger was one of the first Quakers here.
That's right.
The Ballingers, again, the Boulangeries, were Huguenots in France, Protestants, who were persecuted when the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1715, and so had to flee France. And many wound up joining the Quakers and came down the old Philadelphia wagon road and settled here. Henry Ballinger and one of the Hunts bought the land that is now the cemetery, the meeting house, and a section of the college campus, and used to be a whole bunch of land across Friendly. 53 acres purchased in 1757 for the burial ground. So Henry Ballinger was part of that purchase.
Right.
And evidently the Ballingers owned land from what, about
Horsepen Creek all the way through Friendly Shopping Center.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they got that land from, was it Granville? I think
It was a grant from King George of England.
Yeah. So they had quite a bit of land, and some of you have been down Ballinger Road and seen they still farming along Ballinger Road. Some of the last cattle in this part of Guilford County along there. And is this your mother?
This is my mom over here,
Where is she?
right here.
Okay.
She was headmistress of Valencia Academy.
Yeah.
That's my granddad there, and my grandmother, and my sister's right over there with the little bee statue beside it.
Okay.
Now, is Valencia Academy the school or the building near Western Guilford?
That's correct. That was my mom's school, and she's buried right here.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I talked with your mom.
Oh, did you?
I mean,
Cool.
with Patsy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
Hope this doesn't bother anybody.
No, you're good. I'm glad you're doing it.
Oh, perfect.
Are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Do I need to ramp this up? Okay. Well, here at the grave of Addison Bourne, you probably could have guessed that from the terracotta piping and the bricks. How many of you know Bourne Brick? Yeah, still a company here in Guilford County. I think they're down at Pleasant Garden now. But their factories used to be over there around Norwalk and a Spring Garden. The terracotta community, the African American community along there was workers in the terracotta and brick industry that used to be there. They all blew up in the 1960s. And moved out. But Addison Boren, as a 14-year-old boy in the 1830s, was apprenticed to one of those Nantucket coffins, learning forging, not bank forging, but blacksmithing. And his family were heading to Indiana around 1836 or so, with the massive migrations of Quakers out of the South in response to their anti-slavery stance. We went from about 20,000 Quakers in the South around 1800 to fewer than 2,000 by the end of the Civil War. Deep loam and anti-slavery were the reasons for going to the North, or what they called the West, Indiana and Ohio. Well, Addison did not join his family. They were all packed up on their wagon, heading to Indiana, but he was apprenticed already and so didn't want to leave. And as his family headed out on their wagon, his father tossed him a claw hammer and said, "Addison, this is all I can give thee. Make a life with it." And he did. Became quite a blacksmith himself. Eventually had a whole factory where Kathleen Clay Edwards Library is, Price Park. That was the Boren farm for some time, and had quite a factory there making horse-drawn agricultural equipment. And then his sons were hired by John Van Lindley, we'll hear about later on, to help drain the swampy nursery that is now the Arboretum. That was a 100-acre nursery that the Lindleys owned, and they developed terracotta piping to help drain that, and that developed into the brick industry. Well, Addison Boren, at the dawn of the Civil War, realized that even though he was in his 40s by this time, he might be drafted into the Confederate Army, and he didn't want that, so he walked to Indiana and figured, while I'm in Indiana, I might as well look up my family. So he found out where his family were living, went up to the door, knocked on the door. His mother opened it and said, "Why, it's thee, little Addison."
Oh, you did? Oh,
Glad y'all got lots of light you can maneuver. There are a few road hazards here. Are you still hearing me okay? Okay. We're here at the graves of Jonathan and Elizabeth Cox, and the basket here symbolizes Elizabeth's work during the Civil War, when her husband Jonathan, who was a member of the Board of Trustees of Newgarden Boarding School, which had been established in 1837 as a response to those migrations of Quakers out of here. Every Quaker meeting had a little grammar school. And as Quakers left, the teachers left, the students left, so there are few of those schools left for that guarded Quaker education that families wanted. So they established a boarding school, Newgarden, in 1837, now Guilford College. Well, by the beginning of the Civil War, again, there were so few students and so few teachers available because folk had left for the West or the North. The Board of Trustees decided to close the school, sell the property, pay off the debt at the time, which was about $5,000, which was real money back then, and be done with Quaker education. Jonathan Cox couldn't stand that. He said, "I'll take the school on my own shoulders." And with Nereus Mendenhall, the principal of the school, who also stayed here with his wife Oriana, they kept that school open during the Civil War. One of the only educational institutions in the South to remain open during the Civil War, because there were folk like this who didn't leave, and the young men didn't fight. So they didn't march off to join the army. They marched off to the woods to hide out from the Confederate draft officers, and Elizabeth and Oriana hung baskets of food back in the woods for them. and soldiers who had gone AWOL, bushwhacking from the Confederate Army, and any fugitives from slavery who were hiding out back there, which had become quite a sanctuary for fugitives. So these folk are largely responsible, along with Nereus and Oriana Mendenhall, for that school still being there.
Max,
Yeah.
Jonathan Cox's descendant, Jonathan Cox, is living on Ridgecrest in one of the new.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, there are Coxes for many generations, part of the trustees, and I think it was it Joseph Cox who was always insistent that we not put flyers on the doors of the buildings at the college. And to keep him happy, Bill Rogers, president, would come and tear down all flyers on the doors because Joseph Cox wouldn't like it.
Maybe good enough.
Also,
I thought he might like it. Yeah.
We're at the grave of George Swain. Swain was one of those Nantucket names, along with the Macy's and Folgers and Starbucks and Gardners and Coffins and all those folk. And the folk from Nantucket were adamantly abolitionists for a whole variety of reasons. They were sailors. They had seen the Middle Passage. They had witnessed the slave plantations in the Caribbean, so they knew how awful that was. So came here with their abolitionist persuasion. George Swain became involved with a very famous court case involving Benjamin Benson, a free black who lived up in Delaware in 1817 and was kidnapped and sold into slavery to a Greensboro businessman by the name of John Thompson, not the basketball coach, but another John Thompson. And George Swain and two other Newgarden Quakers, also Nantucket descendants, Enoch Macy and Vestal Coffin, learned about this and found out that Benjamin Benson knew his rights and had gone to the court to sue for his freedom. And so they went and backed him up. They'd been very involved in manumission societies and abolitionist work, and so threw their weight behind this case. John Thompson got spooked that he was going to lose his investment, so he sold Benjamin Benson to another enslaver in Georgia. And Benjamin Benson was hauled to Georgia. George Swain, Enoch Macy, and Vestal Coffin went to Georgia and worked until they got Benson extradited back to Guilford County, where in 1820 he won his freedom in the court system. One of the first African Americans. What's that?
How long did that take?
3 years, from 1817 to 1820. Now, if any of you are familiar with East Greensboro, just beyond Bennett College and south of A&T is the Benjamin Benson neighborhood. And through that neighborhood is a road called John Demery Road. And we'll hear more about John Demery later on. He was another free black who was kidnapped and is part of what was the beginnings of the Underground Railroad here. So you'll hear about Vestal Coffin involved with that again. Now, George Swain continued his activity in abolitionism and became the president of the local colonization society. That was another response to enslavement, finding those who wanted to get the heck out of America because they could be kidnapped and it wasn't safe even being a free black, and people would go back to Africa or to Haiti. That didn't work. Easily re-enslaved there, the situations there weren't good. So George Swain, in fact, resigned his presidency in 1825, realizing that that was not the proper response either. But remained here as the community doctor until he died here in 1852, one of the few Quakers to remain in the community. We talked about John Van Lindley earlier. He had the nursery that's now the Arboretum, and in fact had nurseries all over the state of North Carolina, including down around Pinehurst and the Sandhills, and introduced peaches to the Sandhills. So we can owe him for all our peach addiction. He's an interesting character beyond just introducing peaches here. At the beginning of the Civil War, he also went north or west, but to join the Union Army as a Quaker, because he was staunchly opposed to slavery. So as an abolitionist, felt constrained to serve in the Union Army and the cavalry in Missouri, and then came back and was welcomed back into the Quaker community. And as a Yankee, back into the local community as a business person, he got his father's nursery business out of bankruptcy and turned it into quite a prosperous thing. There were nursery stuff out where PTI is. That used to be Lindley Fields. And there are, again, 1,000 acres of peaches and other nursery stock down in the sand hills. He also started a little financial enterprise that eventually became part of Jefferson Pilot. He was also a commissioner of the county and emphasized good roads for business, and employed farmers out of season to make brooms. It had boxcar loads of broom straw come in, had a little factory set up for making brooms to supplement their income. But quite an interesting Union veteran, buried in a Quaker cemetery and welcomed back into Southern society. And he brought peaches. This is the grave of the first president of Guilford College, Lewis Lyndon Hobbs. He was a graduate of Newgarden boarding school and then went north to Haverford. I won't go into all the gory details of Quaker separations, but Haverford was the Orthodox Quaker school, connect with the Orthodox boarding school Newgarden. They wouldn't dare go to Swarthmore with those Hicksites, so he went to Haverford. And at Haverford, he learned a new sport that was derived from cricket, called baseball. And he brought baseball south. Many people believe he was the first person to bring baseball south of the Mason-Dixon, and had quite a baseball team over there. We'll talk more baseball later on. But who are you going to play if he's the first person to bring baseball down here? So he recruited all kinds of baseball teams, mill teams, and so on, and helped develop that baseball culture here, which is important on this night when Atlanta is playing the Astros in the World Series.
Around what year was that?
That was just after the Civil War. Yeah. He became president in 1888. Yeah.
Yeah, but he brought it to
But brought it down here sometime after that. I forget when they say the official birth of baseball was. I think in 1860, something like that. His wife, Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, was the daughter of Nereus and Oriana, we talked about earlier, and helped keep the school open during the Civil War. And she too had gone to the boarding school and then went up north to a private Quaker school in New York called the Howland School. The Howlands were wealthy Quakers from shipping. In fact, they had made the $1,000 donation that finally got the boarding school over the top in their fundraising and able to open in 1837. Her classmate at the Howland School was M. Carey Thomas, the second president of Bryn Mawr College, who turned Bryn Mawr into a national institution. And she was a keen advocate of women's education. When she came back here and was married to the president of the college and traveled throughout the state, she recognized that even decades after the Civil War, the economy was so devastated that families didn't have enough money to send their girls to school. If they had enough money to send anyone to school, it was the boys. The girls were just going to get married. Why waste the education on a girl? Was kind of the attitude at the time. That didn't cut it with Mary. So she started a scholarship program at the boarding school and later the college that helped young women come to the school. And then eventually had enough money, they built cottages on the women's side. Guilford, like most Christian colleges at the time, had a men's side and a women's side, and never the twain should meet. And on the women's side, they built cottages where the young women could work their way through school at a reduced tuition and learn modern scientific home economics. By 1907, they built a proper women's co-op, now called Mary Hobbs Hall, and 55 young women could work their way through school and reduce tuition and learn modern home economics. We'll hear a little bit about one of the matrons of Mary Hobbs Hall when we get to the levering section. But Mary then turned her efforts to public education for women. There was no public college for women in the late 1800s, so she got to work, and we now have UNCG, descended from Women's College. She also was an advocate for modern progressive science education, insisted on teaching evolution in the science department at Guilford in the 1800s, and opposed to capital punishment, opposed to World War I, active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, kind of a modern feminist of her day. So another president of the college, the longest serving president, Clyde Milner. Any of you remember Clyde and Ernestine Milner? Queen Ernestine, I think she was affectionately called, taught I think psychology and proper behavior for women. Stand up straight and behave yourself. Clyde came to be president in 1934 and served until 1965. A couple of really significant things occurred during his presidency, among many others. One was during World War II, he was approached by the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia, as other presidents of Quaker colleges were, and asked, would you accept Japanese American students from concentration camps who want to continue their education, but they've been jerked out of their homes and put in these concentration camps. Let me take it to the faculty. The faculty voted in support of that, and 9 Japanese Americans studied at Guilford College during World War II. Not overly popular off campus. He was cussed and spat at when he went downtown, but on campus they were well integrated. 3 were on the basketball team, 1 was on the football team. The football coach reputedly told him, when we're playing off campus, if anyone asks about your ethnicity, just tell them you're Cherokee. That was okay. In the early 60s, it was during Clyde Milner's presidency that Guilford integrated. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to Pete and Lucretia Moore's graves. But it was a little bit of subterfuge, because at the time, the chair of the Board of Trustees at Guilford was a very conservative white businessman who was simultaneously mayor of Greensboro, chair of the A&T Board of Trustees and the Guilford Board of Trustees, and a slum landlord. Didn't want to integrate. And so they had to work around that, and the way they did it in 1962 was bring 2 Kenyan Quakers. The children of your missionary activity were okay. And then when the sky didn't cave in, they brought in James McCorkle, the first African American during his presidency. And one other significant addition to the faculty during Clyde Milner's presidency was Kurt Victorious. Kurt was an economist, a Jewish economist, head of the German National Banking Association in the 1930s, so you see the problem. In 1939, the American Friends Service Committee helped several thousand Jews and others get out of Nazi Germany who were desperate to get out. Quakers had gone to Germany after World War I to help save 1,200,000 starving German children. Nobody wanted to help German children after World War I. Herbert Hoover, not yet president, but a Quaker from Iowa, was the head of the U.S. rebuilding effort in Europe. And he couldn't find anyone to help the rebuilding in Germany except Quakers. And Quakers sent about 15 staff people over from the United States. Others went from Britain, and they set up soup kitchens throughout Germany and saved 1,200,000 German children from starvation. Some of you know the story about the British Quakers who served chocolate soup in their soup kitchens because the Quakers had cornered the market on cocoa in the 1800s. Cadbury's, Fry's, Roundtree's, all of those folk, because they were abstemious and had to develop other drinks besides alcoholic beverages, so cocoa, tea, and coffee. So they got boxcar loads of cocoa and served chocolate soup and didn't have to twist the kids' arms to eat it. So Quakers remained in Germany after that and helped in the rebuilding. So watched the rise of Nazism, and especially after Kristallnacht in November of '38, Quakers said, we've got to do something. And so Philadelphia, in consultation with the American Jewish community, said, okay, we can figure out a way to get 50,000 Jews out of Germany and repatriate them. And 3 Quakers in December of '38 steamed off to Berlin to present this plan to the Gestapo. And when the Gestapo welcomed them into their offices and heard their plan, they said, well, wait here, we'll go up to our officers and confer. You wait here. Well, what do Quakers do in a moment like that? They went into silent worship. Half an hour later, they came down and said, your plans have been accepted. And Rufus Jones, the head of this delegation and also head of the American Friends Service Committee, or a founder of the American Friends Service Committee, said, well, can we have that in writing? Because we're going to be working throughout Eastern Europe and we'll need validation. He said, the Gestapo puts nothing in writing. So, well, we've got to have confirmation. He said, well, the confirmation is everything that's been said in this room has been taken down in a listening device. They'd been left in a bugged room. The Gestapo had gone upstairs and been listening in on their fine German equipment and couldn't hear anything. And they determined that these folk were legit. I think what also played into that, and from what I've heard from reports of folk who've studied this, a lot of those Gestapo officers had been children saved from starvation by Quaker activity. So you never know what those ripples do that that you throw in the water. But Kurt got out with Gertrude in 1939, eventually came to North Carolina, eventually became a member of the faculty at Guilford who taught economics. How many of you knew Dr. Vicky or Gertrude? Any of you have classes with him? People who've been on the tour before, who had him as a professor at Guilford, have told me he never talked about that experience, never talked about his time in Germany. It was always referred to as Dr. Vicky.
Were they able to get the Jews out?
Several thousand, but then the war started in September and they had to stop operations. But a lot of them wound up Haverford, Earlham, Scattergood, other Quaker institutions. Among those was Bruno Bettelheim. Bruno Bettelheim, the psychologist, was one of those that they got out. You gotta love Quaker graveyards. We have markers for trees. But this is not just any tree. Many of you know this story. This is the Revolutionary Oak. It stood here during the battles of Newgarden, preceding the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, March 15, 1781. A large confrontation between the British forces and the American forces. And as we'll say later on, the meeting house was used as a field hospital, packed full of the dead and the dying and wounded, and there were hundreds who fell in the skirmishes around this area. And so they laid others out on pallets. Wood had already been cut and milled for a larger meeting house that was to be built in the 1780s. And many of them were laid out underneath this old oak tree. So it became known as the Revolutionary Oak, became the iconic tree of this community. Well, in 1955, during Quaker efforts to integrate the public schools here, Eleanor Roosevelt was invited to speak to an AFSC conference in the old meeting house across the street, now Newgarden Hall at Guilford College, speaking to an intentionally integrated audience of blacks and whites sitting together. the local press referred to it as a promiscuous mingling of the races. And during her speech, dynamite went off at the base of this tree. And no one knows exactly why. The three young scalawags that person over at Newgarden meeting, the Friends Homes and member of Newgarden, knows their names and said they were just bad boys, but we don't know their motivation. But they set off dynamite during her talk and so injured the tree that it came down in a storm about 4 years later. It was too massive to come down immediately. When it came down, they sawed it up, turned it into furniture. The meeting house is full of furniture from this tree. Just a couple years ago, the woodworker at the college, now the interim president, Jim Hood, still had access to some of that wood and made a mantelpiece for the new coffee shop over there. And so there's pieces of that tree all over the community. And when they counted the rings, they estimated its birth was 1492. In Mary Mendenhall Hobbs's papers that we have over at the college archives, she talks about, as a young girl, talking with some of the old Quaker geezers in the community about their reminiscences of the Battle of Newgarden, March 15, 1781. And they could recall that there were so many who died in the Battle of Newgarden, the second of 3 skirmishes fought here between the British and the Americans before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, that they had to dig 3 trenches in the graveyard and bury the dead immediately because of camp fever, smallpox, and that they estimate between 125 and 150 dead soldiers, American and British, were buried here. And here's the marker for that site. And the inscription says, British and American soldiers buried March 1781 by Newgarden friends, peace and goodwill. They buried them together as a sign of their brotherhood in death, even though they fought in life. Now, during the Battle of Newgarden, the skirmishes were not only in the graveyard and around the old meeting house, but on the farms and the fields of the Quaker farmland all around the Newgarden community. William and Priscilla Coffin had a farm about where Western Guilford High School is now, just down Friendly. And there were soldiers who fell in their fields during the skirmishes, and they took them in and nursed them. Because they helped American soldiers, William Coffin is now a son of the American Revolution. The whirring sound you hear in the background is him turning in his grave as a Nantucket-born pacifist. But he qualified because he and Priscilla helped American soldiers. The local chapter that gave him this honorific and put the medallion on his grave many years ago said, well, they did help British soldiers too, but they helped Americans, so they qualified. Now you can see in their inscription, they're proudly born in Nantucket and died in 1803. They are also noted for being the grandparents of Levi Coffin, the famous abolitionist who worked with the early abolitionists here in the Underground Railroad, and in 1826 with his family joined that migration of Quakers to the north. And when they built their house north of Richmond, Indiana, we'll hear more about Richmond later on, Quakertown established in 1806 by 3 Randolph County Quakers. Their home became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. The house is still standing. It's now a museum, the Levi and Catherine Coffin Museum. And between 1826 and the 1840s, when they moved to Cincinnati for larger markets for their free labor goods store, they helped between 2,000 and 3,000 fugitives from slavery to freedom through that home alone. And we'll say a bit more about that later. But these are the last of the Coffin family to be buried here. Everyone else after them moved to Indiana. I want to pause briefly at Laura Worth's grave. The Worths are a well-known Quaker family Perhaps the best known of the Worths was Jonathan Worth from Asheboro, who was the Republican governor of North Carolina after the Civil War. And his grandson was William Sidney Porter, more popularly known as O. Henry. Now, Laura Worth was a graduate of the boarding school, went on and got education in Philadelphia to become a registered nurse, one of the first registered nurses of her era, came back and served the school and also other colleges in the community, and in 1918 advised the college through the Spanish flu influenza epidemic without losing a single student, using her scientific understanding of quarantine and isolating students. They had a dorm set aside for those who showed symptoms and quarantined them, and nobody on campus died during the influenza. So thanks to Laura. She then went on to become quite a noted genealogist. If any of you are into genealogy and use the Henshaw genealogies, she did all the research and all the Quaker minutes in North Carolina to help the Henshaw genealogies. Now, most of you who know Quakers know that we can be cantankerous. Well, William Thomas Parker was also fairly cantankerous, evidently. One of my favorite epitaphs in a Quaker cemetery: a lifelong friend, but never a pacifist. Several interesting things beyond the epitaph. William Thomas Parker was born in Perquimans County. Perquimans County is where the first Quakers settled in North Carolina in 1665. The Phelps or Phillips family, who slopped over from Virginia into the Great Dismal Swamp to escape persecution. Quite a few Quakers were escaping the persecution in Massachusetts. Virginia wasn't the best place to escape to because all those Cavaliers and Church of England. But the North Carolina backcountry was ideal, and the Great Dismal Swamp was the idealist of the ideal, because no one's going to find you there. 7 years later, in 1672, the next Quaker they met was William Edmondson, who had introduced Quakerism to Ireland. And after that, 6 months later, they met George Fox, one of the founders of Quakerism. And next year is the 350th anniversary of George Fox and William Edmondson's coming to North Carolina. And we're going to have a bunch of activities around that, so stay posted. The other interesting thing is he was born at Belvedere in Perquimans County. Belvedere used to be called something else, but took its name from a slave plantation of Thomas Newby. Quakers were enslavers. It took them almost a century to extricate themselves from slavery, but by 1778, Quakers in North Carolina had a testimony against being involved with slavery. And much of that goes back to Thomas Newby, who went to his monthly meeting in the early 1770s and said, I can't anymore in good conscience enslave folks. What do I do? At the time, it was illegal to free your enslaved persons. They didn't want a bunch of free Negroes around. So Quakers had to come up with a bunch of subterfuge. One of the major ones was enslavers turned the title to their enslaved persons over to the yearly meeting, the organization of Quakers in North Carolina, to hold title to what became known as Quaker free Negroes. They were free to pursue their own life, but if they were kidnapped, they could say, legally, I'm owned. Quakers were the largest slave owner in North Carolina. They held title to between 800 and 1,000 people for the purpose of their being free.
Wow.
Now, that plantation home of Belvedere, which gave its name to the community, descended on through Newbies until in the late 1900s, one of the Newbies married Wolfman Jack. And they lived in that Belvedere plantation house. And that's where Wolfman Jack died of a massive heart attack in the fall of 1990, in that home. Now, when I say that, and I told that to my students on tours at Guilford, they had no clue who Wolfman Jack was. But I think most of you look old enough that you remember Wolfman Jack. And if you don't, ask some old geezer. Okay, we've got another token here, an apple. George Levering, who died in 1919, was the brother of Ralph Levering, who founded the Levering Orchard up in fancy Orchard Gap, Virginia, just north of Mount Airy. It's now third generation orchard, more famous for cherries, but initially it was an apple orchard. George and Ralph were over in Tennessee. So family lore goes, they were there kind of as Quaker missionaries helping the poor in the East Tennessee mountains, teaching them modern agriculture, and started strawberry farming. And so the story goes, Ralph wanted to spend the rest of his life reaching into the heavens rather than stooping down, picking strawberries, and walked the Blue Ridge 2 different times, covering about 200 miles to find that perfect place to grow apples. And found it early 1900s and founded Levering Orchard. Well, George went on to be a Quaker missionary and founded the Quaker school in Ciudad Victoria in Mexico, and served the Quaker meeting there. During a revolution in the early 1900s, decided this was not a safe place for their founders. They left. He pastored up in Ohio, then came back here and was pastor of the Ashboro Street meeting in Greensboro, now First Friends. During World War I, he preached powerful sermons against buying war bonds, which was not overly popular even with his Quaker congregation. And so for R&R, he would go up to the Levering Orchard to relax, and died of a massive heart attack up there in 1919, leaving a widow with 4 children at a time when Ashboro Street had no pension, they had no insurance. She was impoverished, but was able to get work at Guilford College as matron of what's now Mary Hobbs Hall. And according to her descendants, George White, one of her nephews, told me the story that she ran that place like a Marine sergeant. And one of the great stories about Emily's being matron of the Women's Cooperative Residence Hall was back in the time when women had to sign out of the dorm. There was curfew. They would be back in after 9:30 or they'd be locked out. 2 young women snuck out to probably come over to the cemetery and meet their boyfriends and left pillows under their blankets in case Emily, as she was wont to do, would look in on the rooms as she did duty. Well, they snuck back into Mary Hobbs Hall after whatever they'd done over here in the cemetery probably, and snuck up the stairs, creeped down the hall, opened the door, and Emily sprung out of their bed having nabbed them. So we have grave markers for trees. This is a grave marker for a building. This is where the old Quaker meeting house stood that was used as that field hospital during the Battle of Newgarden, preceding the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. As we mentioned over at the tree, this building was chock full of the dead and the dying, the wounded. They laid folk out on the boards that had been cut and milled in preparation for building a larger meeting house. And they laid wounded soldiers on those throughout the graveyard, many of them underneath that revolutionary oak. Well, later on, around 1791, they finally had the wherewithal, having recovered from the Revolutionary War, to build that new meeting house. It's the classic one that you see in pictures. The 2-story, probably seating 1,000 Quakers, that became the yearly meeting house for the annual gatherings of Friends in North Carolina. And a lot of those boards were incorporated into the new building, many of them into the ceiling boards. And for decades, as the students from Newgarden Boarding School and later Guilford College would file over here for worship. In fact, this is before Guilford College, because that meeting house was torn down in 1875. So It was just Newgarden boarding school students. Those young kids would come over here and have to sit through this hour or more of silence, with the only ministry perhaps breaking the silence, these old geezer Quakers getting up and going on and on and on. And to relieve their boredom, they would look up in the ceiling and see these dark splotches in the ceiling of that wood, remember the story of the Revolutionary War, and imagine the cannon fire and the screams of the dead and the dying, and kind of entertain themselves until meeting was over. Well, when the meeting house was torn down in 1875 to build a larger brick structure over on campus, they examined those boards to see if this was really true and found it was all red carpenter's chalk, but it had served its purpose over the years. With the graves of John and Mary Woody, who are significant for a whole variety of reasons, John Woody was another of those Quakers who walked to Indiana to escape the Confederate draft. He too was fairly old by the time of the Civil War, but knew that they were drafting older folk. So he walked to Indiana, and because he had graduated from the boarding school, he was hired to teach in the Sugar Plain Academy in Boone County, just north of Indianapolis, where one of his students was little Mary Chawner, and they met, married, and continued to teach there until they were recruited to start a Quaker college in Iowa, which lasted only a few years because a lot of those Quakers were moving out to the northwest. So they went down to Oskaloosa, where they helped found what's now William Penn College. Eventually, they went out to Wichita, Kansas, where one of their former students in Oskaloosa had become very wealthy and had bought a defunct college called Garfield University and wanted to turn it into a Quaker college, which is today's Friends University. They then came out here and helped transition Newgarden Boarding School into Guilford College before they were invited out to Southern California to start Whittier College, Richard Nixon's alma mater. And while they were here at Newgarden, the boarding school, he taught surveying classes and surveyed what is now College Road to connect the train station on Market with the boarding school. They also learned while they were here that blacks could still, that late after the Civil War, find white landowners willing to sell them land. And so they bought a tract of land on the other side of that train station and sold it to African Americans. It eventually became known as Woody Side. And those of you know Logie Meacham, he grew up in Woody Side. And generations of folk who worked at Guilford College, Miss Kathy, who was the cook at the board at Mary Hobbs Hall, Saps, there was a Staples, who was the boiler keeper, distantly related to those Staples, who had walked down here from Danville, Virginia, because the Quakers would take care of him after emancipation, and became the boiler keeper of the new boiler room at the college. So generations of folks from Woody Side worked at the college, even at a time when their children weren't allowed to attend Guilford College until 1962. Some of you know this story of why these four members of the Knight family, born on 4 different dates, many years apart, but all died on September 13, 1943. The story is they had a farmhouse along Old Oak Ridge Road, and a Navy pilot ferrying a new fighter plane to Lindley Fields, now PTI, crashed into their farmhouse, killing 4 members of the family. Oliver, the father, had just left the house and was down at the barn. He survived, but saw the plane crash into the house. They'd already lost an infant earlier. Cornelia survived also. She was in a side room and survived. And an aunt also survived, jumping out of her apartment on the 2nd floor. Cornelia went on to have quite a life and credits her father for enabling that. she was the sole survivor of that family. And in that culture, one would expect, even though she was a student at Guilford, to have her father say, you take care of me. I've lost my wife, I've lost my family. But he insisted that she go back to Guilford, get an education, and have a life. And always said, bad things happen to good people. I'm not bitter. Don't let this ruin your life. And so, to the end of her days, she only died 3 years ago, she remembered that act of her father. Now, about a week ago, I was escorting Frank Levering, the current orchardist of Levering Orchard, the third generation, through the graveyard. He hadn't seen his aunt and uncle's graves before, and I brought him by here and told the story of Cornelia Harmon. He said, she was my 8th grade teacher at Mount Airy School.
Wow.
She taught me my love of poetry. He is now a screenwriter, film writer, and poet, owing to Cornelia.
Max,
Yeah.
my dad came upon this
Really?
when that plane went into the house.
Really?
He saw the smoke of it and ran over there, and he said whoever was jumping out of the upstairs window was jumping out as he came up.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Thank you. Now, I'd mentioned earlier at Clyde Milner's grave that they had to come up with some subterfuge to integrate the school. And Pete Moore was one of those who worked on that. In 1953, even before Brown versus Board of Education, Pete was writing letters to the Board of Trustees at Guilford saying, we need to integrate. I mean, this is crazy for a Quaker school with this history not to be integrated, but again, ran into that brick wall of Robert Frazier and the Board of Trustees, but kept working on this and helped come up with the idea of bringing Kenyan Quakers to integrate. He also taught 2 years in the Quaker school in Ramallah, Palestine with Lucretia, and was there during the 48 War, and was taken out by the consulate that felt it was too dangerous for Americans to be there. So Lucretia came home, but he went on to work with AFSC in the rebuilding efforts in Germany, in Karlsruhe. Now here we see a few tokens around the Farrells. Here we get to baseball.
There we go, baseball.
You can kind of tell the Farrells were baseball playing fanatics. This Bill James Historical Baseball Abstract says right here that in the 1920s and 30s, the best hitting pitcher in baseball was Wes Farrell. He was also one of the best pitchers of his era. Won 20 games or more 6 different years, but blew out his shoulder before he could get into the Hall of Fame. Otherwise, he'd probably be in the Hall of Fame with his brother, Rick, whose baseball cards are here. Rick Farrell, who played for the St. Louis Browns. How many of you remember the St. Louis Browns, the Boston Red Sox, and the Washington Senators? Now, for 5 years, they were pitcher and catcher on the same team. But before that, Wes was pitching for the Cleveland Indians, now the Guardians, and Rick was a catcher for the old Washington Senators. If you remember the Washington Senators, first in war, first in peace, last in the American League. And again, he was a very light-hitting catcher, but excellent defensively, so he made it into the Hall of Fame. Well, one of the games that they played growing up on a dairy farm on what's now West Market, now Edgewater Apartments, right across from Woodyside, where they played a lot of baseball with that black baseball team at Woodyside, honing their skills. When they weren't playing with the Woodyside folk, they played kind of a game of home run derby. There were 7 boys on this dairy farm. They didn't have enough for 2 teams, but they would play home run derby. And one would pitch and one would hit. Wherever the ball landed, they'd put a stick in it, and the next person would try to hit past that. Well, in a famous game where Wes was pitching for Cleveland and Rick was catching for the Washington Senators, Rick hit a home run off his brother. His brother was not amused by this. And evidently Wes had quite a temper and was stomping around, threw his mitt down, and really angry. Well, the next inning, Wes hits a home run. As he rounds the bases, crosses home plate, looks down at his brother, the catcher, and says, "Put a stick in that one, Rick." Now this is one of the tragic ironies of this graveyard. We've just visited the Knights, the same row. We come to Mary Nicholson's grave, who died in 1943 in eerily similar circumstances. She was the first licensed commercial pilot, female pilot in North Carolina. There's an historical marker for her out here on Friendly. She was recruited by Amelia Earhart to head up one of the divisions of the 99s, an organization, the 99 female pilots in America in the 1930s. From there, she was recruited during World War II to serve in the Auxiliary Transport Authority of the RAF, the Royal Air Force. That freed up Army Air Force pilots in the RAF to fly the Battle of Britain. The women piloted the new airplanes from the factories to the airfields. And in May of '43, the same year, the Knight family were killed when a pilot crashed his plane into their home, ferrying it to the airport. Her engine seized up, crashed into a stone barn in the English countryside, and was killed. So it's just really eerie that they're in the same row, died in the same circumstances in the same year. We're at the grave of Z Holler. Frank, tell us about Z.
So Z was a great mentor to me. He grew up here in Greensboro and came back here to serve as pastor of the church where he had grown up, which the Bible suggests isn't a good idea. Prophets aren't always appreciated in their hometown, but nonetheless, Z came back here after having finished his PhD at the University of Aberdeen in New Testament. And he had served a number of our Presbyterian churches in the South, came back home, and the thing that impressed me about him was that he was willing to step outside the bounds of convention. Many of you are familiar with what we call the 1979 Greensboro Massacre. And when that happened, most of Greensboro was like, we have nothing to do with this, we have nothing to do with these people. And so it was even difficult to get people to bury the dead. And Z Holler's church had John Forbes's mother in it. And she talked John Forbes into using his services to bury those who were murdered as a part of the Greensboro Massacre. And so from that, Z and Nelson Johnson became close friends, and Z actually rode in the hearse with some of the funeral directors as protection for them. And he and Nelson Johnson together helped form what we know as the Beloved Community Center today. And so you can see why Z would feel right at home here with Quakers. Thank you, man.
Thank you, thank you. Now, evidently, his wife must have had some Quaker connections because I don't know what they were, but you have to have some sort of peripheral connection to Quakers to be buried here. People often ask me, what do you have to do to be buried in a Quaker cemetery? I say, you have to be dead. But at Newgarden, it has to be some sort of connection, however distant. Have faith, only about 5 more. We're here at the grave of Algie and Eva Newland, who were stalwarts in the Quaker community. Much of what we know about the Battle of Newgarden, in fact, about all we know about the Battle of Newgarden is through Algie and his research. He was an historian, taught for many, many decades at Guilford College, grew up in the Alamance County conservative Quaker community. His brother was one of the famous Newland barn builders. If you go over through Chatham and Alamance County and even into eastern Greensboro, there were about 150 dairy barns built by the Newlands. And when Algie and his son Jim set about to build their house on Foxwood in the 1940s, the barn builders came over and got them started. There's a famous picture of his brother with his barn building crew on break, building a barn over in Alamance County. The person they were building the barn for had brought out all these watermelons for break, and then said, I don't have a knife big enough to cut them. And his brother said, we got saws. But anyway, Algie was a great historian, and you can get his book, The Battle of Newgarden, out at the military park in their bookstore. And it talks about the 3 skirmishes here that lasted for 3 hours between the British and the American forward pickets. The first one up around where Price Park is, the second one here, the third one at the crossroads, Ballinger, Fleming, and Newgarden, where about 24 soldiers are buried somewhere there on Ballinger land. But anyway, Algie was also a great baseball player. When he graduated from Guilford College, he could have gone pro, but decided to go on for an academic career. But he played a trick on anybody who was new to meeting him. He had broken his finger playing baseball at college, and so it was crooked. And whenever he met someone new, he would shake their hand and say, oh, look what you did to my finger. Anyway, one of the other books that he wrote was this book about Charity Cook, one of his distant ancestors, who was part of that first contingent of Quakers that came down the Philadelphia Wagon Road and settled over at Cane Creek. The mother of all meetings, it's called, established the late 1740s.
What was the motivation for that migration?
The motivation, the question is, what was the motivation for the migration? There were several. One was, it was getting crowded in southeastern Pennsylvania. Daniel Boone, one of our fine disowned Quakers from Reading, Pennsylvania, once said, if you can see the smoke from a neighbor's chimney, it's already too crowded. And it was getting crowded in southeastern Pennsylvania. It was also getting expensive. There was land you couldn't buy for less than 5 cents an acre. It was pricey. There was war on the frontier, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and then there was this geographical barrier. You couldn't get over the Appalachians. So you hit the wars, you hit the Appalachians, you went south through the Shenandoah Valley and to come down the Philadelphia Wagon Road. The other thing that motivated them was in the 1740s and 50s, there was an intense reformation of Quakerism going on among the elders and ministers in Philadelphia yearly meeting. They thought Quakers had gotten too worldly. They were at ease in Zion and were needing some discipline. And so I think a lot of the scalawags headed down the Philadelphia Wagon Road to get away 500 miles away from the elders. So that explains a lot about North Carolina Quakerism. Anyway, Algie's book about Charity Cook is really well worth the read. She was one of those liberated women of the 1700s, kind of like Mary Mendenhall Hobbs was in the next century. She was a recorded minister and was always being led to go minister elsewhere. I think part of that was she had 13 kids. So she had lots of excuses to get away from home. And on one famous occasion, she went off for 5 years in gospel ministry, visiting all of the meetings in North America. And back then, when you visited the meetings, it wasn't just for tea and crumpets. You met with every family in the meeting, worshiped with them to sense their spiritual condition and give them guidance. And then, again, with no road maps, and on horseback, went to the next meeting and did the same thing, and then went over to England to do the same thing, then to France during the war between France and Germany. She didn't speak any of the languages, but she knew the Spirit would lead her, and she was arrested as a German spy and thrown in a French jail, but then came back after 5 years being away from home, and again, no communication, of course, at that time, arrives back home on a first day morning, a Sunday morning, right at meeting for worship time. So nobody's expecting her, but she goes straight to the meeting house. And at that time, Quaker meeting houses were divided. There was a women's side and a men's side, and there was a partition that went down the middle that was open for worship. But in the ministers and elders gallery, who sat up front on raised platforms, there was kind of a wall between them and a door. Her husband was an elder. He was on the men's side, on the other side of that wall, on the facing benches. She comes in the women's door. This is why you have so many doors in Quaker meeting houses. Comes in the women's door onto, as a recorded minister, onto the women's platform. Husband doesn't see her come in, and as meeting for worship settles, she rises out of the silence and starts to give ministry. Her husband hears her voice for the first time in 5 years. And when she's done with her ministry and sits down, he gets up on the men's side, walks through that door, up onto the platform, gives her an embrace and a kiss, then goes back and sits down, and is eldered after that for that public display of affection.
Did he watch the kids? Did they have a relative watch the kids? Like what happened to her kids while she was gone for 5 years?
The community takes care of them, the husband and the community. It's just a miracle that she had that many kids because she was gone all the time. Her husband was very happy to see her when she came back. But anyway, his response to being eldered was, "I think, friend, if thee had not seen thy wife for 5 years, thee may have behaved in the same way." So he wasn't disowned. Come around to this side. I went on the Deep River Friends meeting graveyard walk the other day, and I learned something I should have known but didn't. On a gravestone, the inscription isn't where the grave is. The grave is over here. So I've always kind of thought, well, this is the inscription, here's the grave. No, the grave was there. But anyway, this marks where a school building stood. The purpose-built little brick school serving the Newgarden community as their little grammar school. And significantly, in 1821, Levi Coffin approached other enslavers around here, David Caldwell and others that he had formed relationships with before, and asked them if they could open up the little school on Sunday afternoons, first days, as a Sabbath school to teach them how to read the Bible. And in fact, this is not the Bible he used, but Anne Trueblood Raper may be interested in this. This Bible was presented to Max and Jane Carter by Elton and Virginia Trueblood on the occasion of the marriage of the above. But anyway, that was a backdoor way of teaching literacy, which was not allowed. It was against the law to teach literacy to enslaved persons. You didn't want a literate enslaved population. They could read the Liberator, they could read maps, they could read the Abolitionist Press, and so they were intentionally kept illiterate. But Levi and others convinced more progressive enslavers that, how could you deny your enslaved persons the benefits of the Bible? It teaches humility and obedience, and how can you deny them, what benefits you and your children so much? Oh, okay, sure. That was a backdoor way of teaching literacy. It was effective enough that within months, other enslavers shut it down. As they said, it was making our enslaved persons restless. And if you look at some of the teachers, Jeremiah Hubbard, who was 1/4 Cherokee, actually accompanied the chief of the Cherokee Nation, John Ross, to Washington, D.C. in 1836 to treat with Andrew Jackson about his Indian policy. Unsuccessfully, but Hubbard spoke fluent Salagi and accompanied them up there. Elijah Coffin was a leading Quaker here and became clerk of the Indiana Yearly Meeting, and a wealthy banker in Richmond, and a gradualist. He was not an abolitionist. He was anti-slavery, but believed that an abolition of slavery would destroy the economy. So he believed in the gradual withering away of the institution of slavery. Levi, his first cousin, was an abolitionist and said, we can't wait for it to wither away. This is a sin. And so Levi got in trouble with his cousin Elijah, who was the big Quaker prima donna in the Indiana Yearly Meeting. So in 1843-44, Elijah Coffin kicks Levi off his committees in the Yearly Meeting and out of the Yearly Meeting, and separates the Yearly Meeting for about 17 years into Indiana Yearly Meeting gradualist and Indiana Yearly Meeting of anti-slavery friends, abolitionists. Vestal Coffin will talk about later. We've already heard about him in the case of Benjamin Benson. Horace Cannon, you know his son. There are markers all over the place for him. There's one on campus. There's one down at Battleground, historical marker. His son was Joseph Gurney Cannon, who, when they left in the 1830s for Indiana, became a student in what's now Earlham College, Friends Boarding School in Richmond, and went on to get a law degree and served his district in Congress in Eastern Illinois for 46 years and became Speaker of the House of Representatives from 1903 to 1911. The old Cannon office buildings named after Horace Cannon's son, and was on the cover of the first Time magazine when it was published. Horace Cannon was also a medical doctor like George Swain, and their farm is where Lowe's Foods is now on Newgarden Road, right across from Vestal Levi Coffin's farm, which later on became the Boren Farm, which later on became Jefferson Pilot Country Club, now Price Park and Kathleen Clay Edwards Library. So anyway, they paid a price and wound up in Indiana. Thanks. Which isn't, it's kind of a consolation prize to wind up in Indiana, but anyway. We're down to our last three. We're at the grave of Georgiana Staley Coble and her husband Samuel Coble. They were down in Randolph County, where she was born during the Civil War. He was a farmer in Randolph County. She was a Methodist, but after the Civil War, it was okay to marry those people who were out of truth so far as to be Methodists. Discipline relaxed a good deal after the Civil War, so he wasn't disowned for marrying a Methodist. But when they started having children, they decided they wanted to move up here to have access to better education, close to the college and Quaker schools. So they came up here and bought the old Lindley farm, now Friends Homes West, and farmed there. And meanwhile, Georgiana's brother, Augustus Eugene Staley, born in 1867, wasn't going to stay in farming. He was still hard scrabble after the Civil War, and he got the heck out of Julian as soon as he could. Moved to Baltimore, who became a food starch salesman, and made enough money as a food starch salesman, corn syrup and all that kind of good stuff, that he bought a food starch factory in Decatur, Illinois in the early 1900s. And like other mill owners, kind of like Lewis Hobbs, recruited mill baseball teams to play the Hobbs Hollow Boys, and Woodyside had a baseball team. The Decatur Staleys were the football team of that food starch industry. Well, you got to advertise your name through these teams, and it doesn't look good if they're losing all the time. And they had a terrible season in 1918. And Augustus Eugene Staley decides, I've got to improve the brand, learns that there's this fine All-America three-sport star at the University of Michigan, just graduated, blew out his knee, so he's not going pro, but is still good, and hires him to coach and play for the Decatur Staley's football team, a young guy named George Hallis. George Hallis improves the team so much that in 1919 they have a great season, The next year, Hallis, A.E. Staley, and other mill team owners go to Canton, Ohio, where they form the National Football League. And in 1922, George Hallis buys the Decatur Staleys and moves them to Chicago, where they become the Chicago Bears, whose mascot to this day is Staley the Bear. So there we have it. Down to our last two. Well, 2 for 1 here, and then one more. This book about William Still, the Underground Railroad, and the Angel of Philadelphia is indicative of what the significance is of Vestal Coffin. We've already talked about Vestal Coffin in the Sabbath School, the Benjamin Benson situation. Vestal helped start the first manumission society in North Carolina in 1814, 1815, regularly petitioned the legislature to end slavery, was a radical abolitionist, and cooperated with a number of blacks here, Hamilton Saul, free blacks, enslaved persons, in getting people out of here. It began in not only with Benjamin Benson and that court case, but in 1819 with what many believe to be the first known activity on what became known as the Underground Railroad in Guilford County, perhaps in North Carolina. It wasn't called the Underground Railroad yet. Why? 1819, no railroads yet. 1819, another free black by the name of John Demery. Remember, there's a John Demery Road through the Benjamin Benson neighborhood in East Greensboro. A free black living with his family in southern North Carolina decides that with the number of people being kidnapped and sold into slavery, he needed an extra layer of protection, move into the Quaker community. So he moved his family into the Newgarden community. He had a cabin very close to the Coffin farm over there on Newgarden Road, where Kathleen Clay Edwards Library is now. One winter night in 1819, the former owner of John Demery dies, and his sons decide they're going to reclaim their economic advantage. They ride into the Newgarden community, find out where John Demery's cabin is, and ride up to the front door and yell out for help, pretending to have been hunting and lost. Demery comes out of the door to see what's happening. They jump him, start tying him up with ropes, and they're going to haul him off and sell him into slavery. His wife comes running out to see what the commotion is, and they knock her unconscious. The daughter comes running out to see what's happening. Before they can knock her unconscious, Demery says, "Run, get Vestal Coffin." So she dashes through the night, finds Vestal Coffin having just stepped outside of his cabin to get a load of firewood, and hearing what the situation is, drops the firewood, doesn't even bother getting his winter coat, but grabs a neighbor and runs back with Demery's daughter to confront the kidnappers. In confronting the kidnappers, he lets him know, "I've done this before. I've got experience with this. You're in trouble. This is a free man. He's got papers. You can go to court. I've done this with Benjamin Benson, and you'd better hightail it out of here before you get in trouble." Well, they're a little confused, don't know quite what to do, and while they're trying to figure out how to respond, the neighbor unties Demery's ropes, and he springs into the woods. Bloodhound's on his heels, and claps and yells at them, but escapes. The kidnappers hop up on their horses, and they hightail it out of there, but they're going to be back. And so John Demery comes back to the Coffin cabin that night, and they figure out what to do. He's got to get out of here. So they map out a way for him to get to Richmond, Indiana, that Quaker town established by 3 Quakers from Randolph County. 6 weeks later, by foot, and it's essentially up 52, over the mountains into Virginia, up to Charlottesville, Charleston, along the Kanawha, down the Ohio to Cincinnati, then up to Richmond, Indiana. 6 weeks by foot he gets there and lives there, working for 2 years to earn enough money to send for his family, who join him in freedom. So 1819, as far as we know, here's the first conductor on the Underground Railroad in this area, and Demery was the first passenger on what became known as the Underground Railroad. Well, he dies on his birthday, October 10th, 1826, only 34 years of age. He probably would have gone on to be more famous than Levi Coffin, his first cousin, had he lived, but dies the same year that Levi and Catherine and their family moved to Indiana, where he becomes known as the president of the Underground Railroad. Well, leaves a widow, Alethea, with a 170-acre farm and 4 children. She doesn't have enough money to move to Indiana, so she remains here for a while until they have enough money to pack up, fill a wagon, and head to Indiana. But the roads are so awful, she gets out and walks the entire way to Indiana. Can't stand it up there. I don't think they developed sugar cream pie or pork tenderloin sandwiches yet. So she comes back here where she becomes the matron of the women's side of the boarding school. When her children then grow up and move to Indiana and settle there, they continue to beg her to come. And eventually she relents, goes out there where she becomes the matron of the women's side of Earlham College, and runs it like Emily Leverett, like a Marine sergeant, because she knows every kid's family from North Carolina. So if they get in trouble, I know who your family is. Straighten up. When she retired, she continued to live in Indiana, but with the provision that when she died, she was to be returned to the side of her husband. 1891, 65 years a widow, she dies in Indiana and is returned here. And her, he's got this long epitaph talking about how everyone's mourning him, including his widow. All of I could see for the longest time was died in Indiana. But if you dig down far enough, it says buried in her wedding dress. And I usually get that response from folks. How romantic. Also, she's still fit in it. But if you're walking back and forth to Indiana, you'll probably fit in your wedding dress. Okay, one last one. Well, thanks again for hanging in here for so long. But this is the last one. You can say hey to the Starbucks and Folgers Graves as you walk by, but we won't stop for coffee there. I wanted to end with this story of Edith Mackey. We've talked a lot about the Underground Railroad, abolitionism, the activity of this community in anti-slavery and integration and civil rights. And Edith indicates how close we actually are to all of that. Many of us in this crowd knew Edith well. She died at 104, about 11 years ago. She was very active at Friendship Meeting. Every morning when Jane and I were jogging before our work, we had encountered her about 6 o'clock in the morning going over to the swimming pool of the old Y when it was at Guilford College in her 90s. Lived at friends' homes, but grew up in Indiana, western Indiana, on one of the routes of the old Underground Railroad, where her grandparents were conductors. Now, she didn't live during that time, but her grandparents were conductors. And Edith remembered as a young girl sitting in her grandmother's lap and hearing the stories of the Underground Railroad. And one that she related to many of us was of her black aunt, Annie. And the story goes that when her grandparents, probably in their early 20s in the 1850s, were asleep in their cabin on the western frontier of Indiana on one of those major routes going up to Canada of the Underground Railroad, they heard the knock on their front door. Now, there was a lot, again, enslaved persons were kept illiterate, but they had oral instructions. One of the instructions was the knock that you used on a station. And it was 3 loud bangs, a long pause, then 2 loud bangs, and you knew it was fugitives and not slave chasers. Another one of the oral instructions was if you get on the road, and they traveled by night, so it was very difficult anyway, but sometimes you come to a fork in the road. Now, Yogi Berra would say you take it. If you're on the Underground Railroad, you got to take the correct fork, because you've got to get away from the folk chasing you. And they knew that at that important junction, there'd be a nail driven into the side of a tree 3 feet above ground, indicating the direction you go in. There are all those sorts of things. The Underground Railroad songs, Deep River, Wade in the Water, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Follow the Drink. These were all oral things. Well, her grandparents heard the knock. They sprung out of bed, and there was a group of fugitives, including a young woman who's visibly pregnant and gave birth to a little daughter named Annie in the bed they just sprung out of. Well, the group stayed there for about 24 hours, resting, getting food, re-energizing themselves, but they had to get to Canada because the Fugitive Slave Act meant that you could chase your enslaved property into free states and reclaim them and haul them back south. So they said, we've got to get to Canada, but we're not going to make any headway with a newborn baby. Would you keep this child, little Annie, until we get to Canada? When the trail grows cold, we'll come back. They said, well, of course. Off they go, and they never came back. They raised that child as their own. When she turned 16, she said, I want to find my birth family. And of course, by this time there are railroads. He said, sure. They got her a ticket, gave her provisions, and she went to Canada and found her birth father and learned that her mother had died on the way. Never got to Canada. He had remarried, had a new family. She wrote back, want to stay here, of course, but maintained correspondence throughout her life. So there are people in this group who knew Edith well, who grew up with a black aunt who was born in slavery. I mean, that's how close we are to some of that. So anyway, thank you very much for being a part of this. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to share the stories. We'll head back that way, and again, if you want any copies of the books, there they are. And hang out over there too if you have any questions, and really appreciate your hanging in.